Hello, everyone, and welcome to a talk on reflecting real-life cities in video games, exploring Forza Horizon 4's Edinburgh. My name is Eduard Gafton, and I am an MSc Comparative Literature student at the University of Edinburgh, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this talk. So let me first guide you through the structure of the talk. So I suspect that this talk will last about 40 minutes, and it will be followed by a discussion on Teams where you can ask questions, you can give feedback, and you can also ask for my input on anything that you are particularly interested in that I have not covered. So let's first begin with the first tile, the tile screen. So you will see I have a pointer. Hopefully, also you will notice that I have some captions to help you. Um, my hope is that the captions will be fairly good, but they seem fairly accurate so far. So yeah, let me guide you through the title screen. So this is a screenshot I took in the game that I've made in the game. The license plate is HNG Lab, History and Games Lab, which is obviously the lab which is organizing the talk. And here beyond me, beyond us, behind the car, or at least in front of the car, is Edinburgh Castle, as it is realized in Forza Horizon 4. So let's move on with first talking about defining video games. Now, I don't necessarily want to get into this conversation for too long. I don't want to necessarily speak about video games as a whole. So suffice then to say and to define video games as games which we play thanks to an audiovisual apparatus and which can be based on a story. So this is Esposito. This is a critic on video games, which has said that we need to come with a simple and clear definition on what video games are, and this is what he suggested in one of his articles. So for all intents and purposes, we will be running with this definition of video games for the purposes of this talk. And you might as well accept any other definitions, but this is the definition that I had in my mind when constructing this talk. So one thing that I've noticed, and that since I'm a gamer, since I play video games, is that video games have increased dramatically in realism and fidelity over the last couple of years. As a result, they come closer and closer to reflecting real life cities truthfully. So if you've been watching the video game landscape, you've seen um, console generations and PC gaming move from SD to HD to now 4K to improve frame rates to higher fidelity, to dynamic environments, and a lot of the things that developers thought about the game, like that they talk about are how dynamic it is, how real it looks, how true it looks to the real world. Now, it is important to realize that, like, I've put truthfully in the quotation marks because there is obviously no way that it can be ever truthful. But let me show an example of a game that came out very recently, last year in fact, and how they depict a certain place in video games, a certain real place in video games, in their video game. So this is Yakuza Like a Dragon, a game that comes from Japan, from a studio called Ryuga Gotoku. Yakuza is a famous Japanese franchise. Sometimes to its detriment compared to GTA, or called the Japanese GTA. But nevertheless, this is a rendition, a reflection, if you will, of Tokyo's Kabukicho district. So here you see all the lights, all the street lights, all the streets, the puddles, the ray tracing on the puddles, and our protagonist Ichiban walking the streets of this area. This is a district this is based off a district in Tokyo called Shinjuku, famous for being the red light district in Tokyo. So at a glance, you would say this is exactly how it is. This looks very genuine, and in many cases, that is because they do actually scout locations. They do actually go. They take extensive notes, and so on. So before we talk about this type of city, let's first explore the evolution of cities in video games. Let's talk about a bit briefly about how we got to this point. So, in researching for this talk, I went to a Ubisoft website. Ubisoft, obviously, being the pioneers of a certain kind of open world games. With the Assassin's Creed franchise, The Crew, Watch Dogs, and so on and so forth. So I stumbled across a study, actually a piece written by Vincent Manilev, who is a writer for stories at Ubisoft.com. And in this particular piece, he was building on a talk at a video game conference hosted by journalist Erwan Cairo, in which, to quote Manilev, this is from his piece, the very first video games probably featured two-dimensional backgrounds, distant horizons, or scrolling panels that players could explore in a straight line. Journalist Erwan Cairo called this the decor city, a space which provided some context for the player to imagine their adventure. So Manilev here starts in his. This is an article about how reflections of real life cities are created in video games, how these spaces are created. So he starts from this idea that this journalist had from this talk that he gave of the decor city. So that is the genesis of Manilev, will continue to say. So. In the rest of his piece, he goes on to say, to explain that, based on what Cairo was saying, that the core city is a place which provided the visual and spatial context for your adventure as a player. So here is an example from a game called Quackshot, starring Donald Duck, sort of like Indiana Jones, but Donald Duck, in which we clearly see the cityscape in the background. But obviously, naturally, as per the definition, this is only the decor. This is only the context. This is only the backdrop for your adventure. It is not necessarily some a place that you explore, and it isn't even a place that exists in the video game beyond this particular texture right here, right? So this is what games started from, in their representations of cities. Then we move on. Manilev also then moves on to defining, to charting a sort of evolution, a sort of chronology. So firstly, cities and video games were decorative, were decor, right? And the second stage is the stage city. Then we go to simulated city, and then now most recently, and in the games that we mostly play nowadays, the open world games, they have platform cities. And this is a cover of SimCity 2000, the ultimate city simulator, which is, by the by, a fantastic game made by Maxis. So let's speak about the stage city. So Manilev continues by saying that the stage city, then, following the decor city, is a place where you recharge and restock before starting off again. A stage city can look elaborate, but is usually explored very little. And this is an example I have from Streets of Rage 2, where you fight goons, which is a beat 'em up, where all the screens are transitive. You go from the left to the right, and whereas the stages do look expansive, right? There are details here. That bar looks like you could potentially go inside of. It is actually very superficial. It is actually very hollow. You are meant to progress in this sort of linear fashion from left to right. You don't really explore it. It is a stage. It's the stage for the adventure. So if the decor city was the backdrop, this is the stage. And then we move on to the simulated city. So this is interesting because as games grew in complexity, this is 92, this is 93, 91, and even like with SimCity 2000 already. So we have the simulated city, um, which is a city where a player can control their urban environment as a city builder, like in the Anno series. So with Anno and with SimCity, and then going on to City Skylines, we have games where, especially PC games, where the player is in control of building the city, of building the roads, building the architecture, deciding where hospitals should go, where a fire department should be based, and so on and so forth. So this becomes a different type of city because it is also not necessarily a reflection of any given city in real life, and unless you build it so. but it is rather a simulation of an imagined city, usually, of because the players have the potential to create the city that they imagine. They simulate a city. So Manilev here describes and mentions the Anna series, and I also want to draw attention to City Skylines, which is a phenomenal um, city builder game, in which, as you can see, you can build a bustling metropolis, right? And then we go to today, to the most common city seen in video games today, which is the platform city. So Manilev ends, his theory on the types of cities by saying that today we're seeing the emergence of the platform city, a playground that can be manipulated and navigated at will. So open worlds become more sophisticated than ever. You can choose to follow the main story or simply take a stroll, experiencing the world with no preset linear sequence. And you can kind of credit the invention of the platform city, in to at least to some extent, to a game like Grand Theft Auto 3, which came out at the beginning of the millennium and the century, which definitely revolutionized how we explore not only cities but also 3D environments, right? So that was revolutionary at the time it came out. And my example here, the example I'm choosing to tell you about, is Marvel's Spider-Man, in which obviously you take the mantle of the superhero and you web sling through the city. You explore Manhattan, you explore New York, and you have the opportunity, the ability to follow the main story or take a stroll or partake in any open world activities. Right, so these are vast playgrounds essentially. So we've seen all of the types, all of the city types. So the core, stage, simulator, and platform, right? So these are the main cities that we see in video games. How do you create a platform city? How does one create a platform city? So in the same article, because he is a writer at Ubisoft, or at least for the Ubisoft Stories website. Um, Manilev continues by saying that, like, at Ubisoft, any realistic video game, again, realistic in quotation marks, that is important. Any realistic video game project goes through phases of detailed documentation, research, and often even exploratory trips. So it is a very in-depth process that takes a while. There's stories of even Hellblade, which is the game Alex presented, my colleague presented, and the last talk. The stories about developers going to the places that they're going to recreate and reconstruct, and taking notes, taking reference images. So it is a big part of creating modern day contemporary platform cities in video games. So for example, for the then upcoming Watch Dogs Legion, this article came out in June of last year. The game Watch Dogs Legion came out in November. Senior tech director Cyril Masquiler met up with experts in London, where the game takes place. So, they had consultants in London, on hand in London, to tell them about how the city works itself. So, Manilev continues to describe the process of building Watch Dogs Legion, and he says the team consulted an architectural firm, finding out more about the city structure, for example, pipeline networks, and even local animal species. The architects created a mental image of London for the developers who weren't physically there, and the game's editorial team assembled a world-building toolkit from their learning. So there is a obviously. So how do you start by recreating a real life city in your video game? And when do you stop? When is the point that you decide you have enough? And in this case, which and games like these, which are so detailed, so expansive, so full of life, it can be hard to find a stopping point, I suppose, if you're a researcher. But again, there are some architects that go on site. They speak with the experts, and then um, you know in a collaboration between an architectural firm and the game developers themselves, you create this mental image, and this is important, a mental image of London. So it is important to realize that London in a video game, or any other town for that matter, is not what it is in real life. It is a mental image, it is a reflection, right? And then um the architects create a mental image together with the game developers, but it is the game's editorial team that assemble the toolkit, that decide, what goes where, how much we condense the town, how much can we afford to recreate. So there is a team that goes on hand, on site, works with experts, and then they report their findings to the editorial board, which then take the executive decisions, basically. So this is interesting because this toolkit that Manilev mentioned, that Ubisoft, for example, comes up with, at least in the case of Watch Dogs Legion, is a set of information explaining different systems that constitute the game world at a macro level, including details about the natural environment, territorial conflicts, local mythologies, economic development, political powers, and sociological segmentation. This allows developers to recreate a complementary city in a smaller scale and little by little build a living video game world. So it's interesting how they start with the towns at a macro level. So the environment is obviously going to be a factor. Territorial conflicts, if it's the case that those are factors. In the case of Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Valhalla, the local mythologies, and just mythology in particular, had a big role, especially because they were reconstructing a real life place. As it was ages ago, as it was hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So this is all very interesting, but what drew my attention to this is that the toolkit allows developers to recreate a complementary city in a smaller scale, and little by little build a living video game world. So you start macro level from the town itself, from the real life place that you want to reflect, to emulate, and then you build a complementary city as a sort of mirror, which is smaller in scale and obviously doesn't have the detail and all the buildings that the real city has. So it's a condensation. It's a mental image, and here we have a map of London and Watch Dogs Legion. So you see the city of Westminster, you see Camden, you see the city of London, and so on and so forth. But obviously, it is reduced in scale and condensed to fit what Ubisoft wanted to do. Um, and this is interesting because like I've asked myself, and I ask this of video games when I play them, especially open world ones that have platform cities. Why condense the world? Obviously, beyond how huge of an effort that would be, beyond the cost of the production. What is it about real life cities that begs condensation? And Manlev has an interesting point. He says that we are all no stranger to tedious trips between real-world cities, commuting long and mundane distances, or perhaps waiting in line at immigration checkpoints for hours. No player would want to relive these experiences, so cities have to become a condensed version of what they are in real life. This means creating distances that are optimal and logical rather than technically accurate, and offering faster and more convenient travel that again defies real-world logic. So there is a sort of tedium in real life, and there is a sort of tedium in present in the scale of a real world city. Like the traffic, like how long it takes to navigate, that we don't have the place for in video games, because video games are meant to be primarily for fun. Video games, as we've defined them, are meant to be played. Are meant to and playing is all about having fun. Um, so it is interesting that there's a tension between video games and reflecting real life cities, between the optimal and logical and technically accurate. So there's a decision that you as a developer must make, and you must offer fast and convenient travel. Because if your world is not fun to explore, why would a player inherently desire to explore it? If it was if imagine if GTA 5, for example, like a massively popular game, would be entirely accurate or realistic, right? Like there would be a certain amount of tedium. And in fact, with a Rockstar game, such as Red Dead Redemption 2, that is an interesting conversation, because that has been one of the issues of that game, of this desire to go for realism when perhaps it is not warranted, to attempt at realism when it is perhaps tedious. So this is a very delicate balance of making a real life city both instantly recognizable and instantly iconic, because the town itself, if the town itself is iconic in and of itself, but also make it fun to explore. What is the difference between exploring real life London and the London in Watch Dogs Legion, for example, or like the um, Kabukicho in Tokyo versus the equivalent in Yakuza Like Dragon. So to this end, I've attached here a picture of the biggest world in any simulator or game that I know of personally. And this is a very interesting example because Microsoft Flight Simulator, obviously, as the name implies, is part game, part simulator. In terms of the commercial aspect of it, it is sold on the Microsoft Store as other Microsoft published and or developed games. But it is definitely a simulator in the sense that, like, it goes against what Manilev says here about condensing, because in Microsoft Flight Simulator, obviously the actual flights themselves um, take part during the actual real life hours that it would take you to fly from one point to another. So let's say you, for example, you wanted to fly from London to Rome. In Microsoft Flight Simulator, that journey would take you exactly as long as it would take you in real life, because it is meant to be a simulator. Obviously, you can tweak the settings, but the idea is that is the point. The point is the tedium and some simulators, right? So, like, the point of a simulator is the tedium. It is the experience. It is being that. But most video games are not simulators. Most video games are about fun, are about, as my left says, about being faster, being convenient, being even efficient, right? So this is an interesting example of a game that, like, goes against what we believe games to be. To this end, I highly recommend No Clips YouTube documentary, How Microsoft Flight Simulator Recreated Our Entire Planet. I will put the link, and I have actually put the link in the description where you can access it. No Clip is a wonderfully Patreon supported uh, gaming documentary series made by people in the industry. So they have a bunch of documentaries, but for this particular talk, I do recommend this one. And for everyone interested in geography and topography and multimedia cartography, I think this is a fabulous, fascinating example. So yes, my first conclusion from reading Manilev and going through all of these types of cities, and going through the process of how they develop a game at Ubisoft, is that because of the sheer scope of the real world and due to the tedium of traversing it, video game cities are almost always necessarily condensed versions of what they are in real life, right? So, like, if it's if except maybe if it's in this case Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is perhaps not a video game. What is the game aspect of it? It's perhaps a conversation for a different time. But almost always necessarily condensed. The only video game I can think of that doesn't abide by this rule, which condenses real life cities if they in their depictions, is Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go, which is a location based, data based AR experience video game, right? And I'm quoting here from Gong, Hassing, and Mouse, which say that Pokemon Go has been credited with popularizing AR, which is artificial reality, sorry, augmented reality, in fact, as it has introduced the technology to a broad consumer audience. Unlike most video games, which create a parallel virtual world in which players interact and communicate with each other through information technologies, the game has been praised by some critics for potentially improving players' interaction with the real world. So again, you have, you know, in video games, you interact and communicate with a parallel virtual world where the cities in this case are condensed, right? But in Pokemon Go, it is a vastly different situation, because the game itself is only the means, and players roaming, the streets, the world, is actually, in fact, the point. The point is going out, seeing the world as it is. Um, the, the app, the video game itself in this game, is because becomes a platform for exploration rather than the means through which to achieve it. So it is a very, very interesting counterexample. Um, but yeah, so let's then move to my case study, right? The case study that I have proposed for Forza Horizon 4. So first of all, what is Forza Horizon 4? So Forza Horizon 4, a game which came out in 2018, is a racing video game developed by Playground Games and published by Microsoft. It is the 11th game in the overall Forza franchise and the fourth game, obviously, in the Horizon franchise, right? The game is set in an open world environment based on a fictionalized Great Britain, with regions that include condensed representations of Edinburgh and Lake District, among others. So obviously, Forza Horizon 4 in particular is not just about Edinburgh. It has a part of Scotland and a part of Great Britain, but in this talk, I will be focusing more or less mostly on its depiction of Edinburgh, the town itself, the city. And one other thing that is bears to be mentioned about Forza Horizon 4 is that it's also notable for introducing dynamic, changing environments, which is fascinating in terms of like video games and how they deal with weather and how they represent the city in the changing weather. To this point, in fact, actually, with the changing weather, in the making of Forza Horizon 4, there's a Guardian article that came out in 2018. Sorry, there's a typo here. This article is from 2018, not 2008. So, in an interview with the Guardian, developers from the art director Benjamin Penrose, Forza Horizon 4 art director, spoke about how the art team became obsessed with capturing the different ecological themes of the British countryside, from cultivated farmland to lakeland. It's made us analyze the country in a depth we wouldn't have before. On our drives to work, we'd pay attention to when things began to change in each season. When does a horse chestnut tree reach its most colorful point in autumn? So you see here how, like with Watch Dogs Legion, there is a sort of obsessive, detail going into all of these games. There's so much, depth and character to these representations. And there's a lot of like research, hands-on research. Furthermore, like Stewart, in the Stewart article, the art director says that even just walking to work would be picking things up, sometimes literally. We had a whole back of the art studio filled with bags of reference materials, twigs, leaves, flowers. I had an artist come up to me at the end of the project carrying a plastic bag that was now just full of brown liquid. He said, "Ben, I think we may now be harboring tropical diseases. We had to throw it all out." So again, you see, like, even the minutia is represented in Forza in this case, right? Like, even the entire world has such depth and such detail. But let's speak about the town itself. And let me yes, so there's also this idea that there's the interview ends with the art director saying there's almost been a sense of rediscovering what Britain is. And my second takeaway from my talk is that, in my case, for example, I moved to in my personal case, I moved to Edinburgh last September to start my master's at the university. And for me, playing Forza Horizon 4, I've almost had a sense of discovering what Scotland is, because obviously the pandemic made it impossible for me to visit the area surrounding Edinburgh. So if the team at Forza Horizon 4 rediscovered Britain and Scotland and Edinburgh, um, through realizing the game, I've discovered it through playing it, right? Um, so yeah, let's jump into the case study. Let's jump into Forza Horizon 4's platform city, namely, obviously, Edinburgh. So first of all, I'm going to show you a series of pictures, and we can look at them together. Um, there is no real, obviously. And the way I first conceived this talk, I was about to turn this into a fun exercise of guessing which is if the photo depicts the real town or the city town. But some evidences that this is fake come up from the beginning. So obviously, There are almost there are not enough cars, right? There's four cars, and all of them look slightly out of place in this sense, and there's no people, notably, right? And then the National Gallery doesn't have an exhibit, it doesn't have any, it doesn't publicize anything, so it's a bit hollow in this sense, and those are obviously telltale signs that this is fake. So let's then compare it with a real life image of the National Gallery. And again, I have it here in the on the slides themselves, but these are all Twitter images I have collected from Chris Trenham, who is a senior environment artist and player on games, who after publishing and developing the game, after working on it, went back to Edinburgh and some regions of Scotland and took pictures to compare it with the game. So this is one of his pictures that he took in Forza inside the game, and this is the same building, the same, or vastly the same angle in the real world, right? So obviously it is very close. I think if you look back, if we compare, it is very close down to the statue on top of the National Gallery, and even the fence in front here. It is incredibly close. Obviously condensed, we can already see how this is the National Gallery is much smaller in the game because the entire world is smaller itself, right? In and of itself. So then the developers need to make decisions about like what it is that we're going to going to drop. How do we condense everything, but still maintaining the original artistic vision behind. For example, developing the building of the National Gallery. So this is the Royal Mile in Forza. And obviously, again, what you will notice is that there are no people. Forza is for all intents and purposes, an idealized version of Britain. A Britain where there's no people in the sense. You can just drive wherever. Even though Edinburgh is a town, like which is wonderful to walk in. Forza imagines it as a perfect town to drive in. So there's not many people. There's only one lone car in the distance. So an ideal playground, right? But obviously you can tell storefronts have been changed, obviously, naturally, and yes. But in terms of the spirit of the Royal Mile, I think I think you understand where we are. I think this is iconic enough. I think you can tell precisely what this is. And in fact, let's compare it with a real life picture. This is the Real Mile. Again, same developer that took the photo that I'm crediting, and same angle as the pictures he takes in real life. So obviously, the most important feature here is the tower, right? And even though obviously there's a lot of people and this is turned into a walking street, it is very close, right? So I think it is not far-fetched. Okay, so this is the Scots monument in Forza, and again, look at how impressive the details on the monument itself are, right? How the arches look, right? So again, it is slightly startling not to see traffic, except for the lone car, and not to see people. But in terms of the places themselves, if you compare it to the real life world, obviously the shopping malls are gone. But I think the Scots Monument represented in Edinburgh is in Forza Horizon 4 is excellent, and you can even see this building in the background here, and that does a lot to bring you into the space. Obviously, there's no buses. That's also one of the developers' main observations on Twitter, where he posted pictures that there are no buses in our idealized video game Forza Horizon world, right? So this is where we see that the tedium is gone, meaning the traffic, meaning the public, meaning the brands, meaning the adverts. It is Edinburgh, but with no traffic, no people, but more fun. The objective is to have fun in this Edinburgh. Cockburn Street is an interesting example because all of the buildings here are modular to be on the street. Again, you get a sense of where you are because of how the street goes up like this. Like how it's built on a hill. Again, some bland marketing, obviously, which would fill in the spot of real life Edinburgh. But then when we go to real life Edinburgh, right, we see so many parked cars. and see the people. And it's already busier. It's already full of the tedium that we perhaps do not welcome in our video games, right? So look at how close this is. Again, I think this building in particular really helps to bring you in to the world of Edinburgh in Forza Horizon 4, right? Again, you can look at the individual structures, right? Obviously, it is not 100%, but it is a reflection that is, good enough. And let's go out of Edinburgh for a bit to for me to show you something that I think is interesting. So this the Glenfinnan viaduct, right? And obviously, one of the things that you will notice is that I've added here plus the Flying Scotsman. Now, what is the Flying Scotsman? You may ask. Well, the Flying Scotsman, at least in the world of the Forza Horizon 4 game, is the Jacobian steam train that runs the viaduct. Commonly made famous as in the Harry Potter series, and referred to lovingly as the Hogwarts Express. But in the game, they did actually, in fact, did not get a license for the train. They were able to get the license for the viaduct itself, but they were not allowed to get the license for the train, which is interesting, right? And also one other deviation from real life, as we will see, is this road does not exist. The road that goes through the viaduct, this path that goes like this, that winds, does not exist and has been made simply to allow players to explore the viaduct more easily, right? So this is an example where like it needs to be optimal and it needs to make sense in the world of the video game rather than the world as we know it, right? So there are concessions that you have to make when you adapt a video game, which are interesting. So let's look at the real life viaduct. See, so the path doesn't really exist, and there's a lot of trees that don't exist in the video game, and there's a lot of concessions that were made, but the spirit of the viaduct is here. Even though it looks definitely condensed, definitely smaller, definitely less impressive in the video game itself. Okay, so let's here compare a map of Edinburgh. So Forza is on the left and Google Maps is on the right, and here is where we see exactly how they've condensed it, right? This is a satellite view, satellite data, right? So we see how much smaller the town of Edinburgh is in Forza Horizon 4 versus how it is in Google Maps, right? So the section right here, for example, is almost accurate, but again, it is slightly condensed, and even Artist right? Almost this part doesn't exist. But the town itself actually is, like doesn't sprawl, these urban areas over here don't exist. It is very much the center of Edinburgh that's been reproduced, right? Like this is the center. Obviously, if you take a look, there are big gaps, right? And one notable gap that you will notice, is right here. So around this area is where the university would be if it were in Forza Horizon 4. But as we will speak about in notable absences from Forza Horizon 4, there are three significant absences, right? First of all, there's no Scottish Parliament building. Second of all, the Palace of Holyrood House does not exist in Forza Horizon. And third of all, any academic institution whatsoever does not exist, which also means, obviously, that there is no University of Edinburgh, which is interesting. And as you can see from the satellite data, there are no buildings over here. Like the meadows exist to some sort of fashion, but on visiting the would-be campus in the game, you see that it's just a fence, and then there's just a park essentially, which is this park. So it is interesting to see that there are certain restrictions that go beyond the tedium of the game, that go beyond wanting to make the game fun, but there's also some sort of like real life restrictions, copyright restrictions. So on speculating why these buildings, for example, would be absent, I've come up with two fairly natural, fairly pedestrian reasons. Number one, for why they were not included is money, time, and effort. Probably a combination of each. There's more effort in recreating buildings and making it faithfully, and analyzing them. It takes money. It takes effort. This is already a condensed version of Edinburgh. But secondly, copyright law is interesting when discussing, how do you reflect a real life city in a video game. So it is either one or both, right? So probably the real reason, this is obviously highly speculative, is somewhere in the middle. But a fun example of copyright law enacted and which has changed the look of a video game comes when discussing Marvel Spider-Man, which I have previously mentioned. So let's go back and discussing Marvel Spider-Man for a second. So the Chrysler Building in New York, because Marvel Spider-Man, obviously Spider-Man is a New York hero. He is a hero in Manhattan. So the Chrysler Building is one of New York's most iconic landmarks, right? Therefore, it has also appeared in numerous media, including video games, Marvel's Spider-Man 2018 being the last notable example. Now, the last notable example is interesting because when we look at the sequel to Marvel Spider-Man 2018, Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales, which came out last year in 2020, we will realize that the Chrysler Building itself has been replaced by, this uh, concrete building, right? This definitely not Chrysler building. And in an interview with Game Informer, Game Informer asked Insomnia Games, the developers of Marvel Spider-Man, to have a statement, and it basically comes down to not having been given permission to recreate it in the video game. And this is supposedly because the building itself changed ownership in 2019, and the new owners have decided to not permit Insomnia Games to include the building's likeness. Even more interestingly, in the same Game Informer article, uh, the journalists in Game Informer have consulted with a lawyer which specializes in disputes such as this one, and supposedly, um, for example, if you were to film a movie in New York, you could film the skyline, which would include the Chrysler Building, because it is a part of Manhattan skyline. But because in Spider-Man you can actually traverse it and scale it and see the model in detail, you will. That's the supposition that's why it hasn't been included, because you can really take the Chrysler Building inside the game, right? You can really scale it, you can climb it, you can web sling around it in these two particular games. So there is a big conversation about copyright law and how and when to use it with regards to cartography, with regards to geography, real life geography in video games, and obviously in this case, real life architecture, right? Like, this is a very unique design, very iconic design, but also copyrighted. Also belongs to someone. Um, so another takeaway that I have from here is that video game cities are sometimes condensed because they are not allowed the permission to replicate real life cities, right? So there are modifications, there are changes, there are implementations that go beyond the other reason that we've mentioned. So that is particularly interesting, how the law simply does not allow you to to make a truthful real life city, or like impedes you, or like in this case, you are not as immersed as if this were a Chrysler Building. And as we've mentioned before, especially modern video games are chasing after fidelity, chasing after immersion, chasing after realism, right? Blurring the lines. So it is interesting how sometimes copyright law can prevent that, and make the exact opposite effect. Like when seeing this Chrysler Building, I'm immediately taken out of the experience. Any immersion is kind of gone in that sense. So here are my three conclusions, and the conclusions of this talk in general. So sorry, four conclusions I have. So video game cities are almost always condensed versions of real life cities, and we've discussed this to an extent, for various reasons. To a certain extent, they allow us to rediscover certain real life cities and to analyze our potential biases around them and all perspectives of them, right? So, like, in Edinburgh, I can analyze my bias about Edinburgh when seeing a Edinburgh that looks nothing like the one I know, or like the one I don't even know, or like even if it does look like the Edinburgh I know, what's the difference and why do those differences matter, right? I'm able to analyze my relationship with a particular city based on playing, a reflection of it, based on living in a reflection. And the other two conclusions I have, here we go, are that as long as copyright law functions as it does, video games might not even be allowed to replicate video game cities truthfully. So what happens if in a in a distant future, we go, again, we chase after realism, and we video games will face this type of roadblocks. This is an interesting ongoing discussion, right? Because even Miles Morales, the video game, came out in November 2020. So there are gray areas that have not been properly addressed in video games, and specifically about copyright law and copyright law, implementations. That is a very nebulous area. And in this particular case, the supposition is that Insomniac Games has chosen to err on the side of caution rather than potentially risk a lawsuit. And finally, and this is important for you if you care about the history part of the talk, and you're wondering what it is. So, video games depictions of real life cities are capsules in time, as they also say something about our values and beliefs at the time of production, right? So, they are also a cultural product of the year. So they are also part of our collective histories in this sense, right? And we are dealing with historical buildings. How do we represent historical buildings? Do we make changes to them? Do we replicate them in scale? What does it mean that the Scots Monument is in Forza Horizon 4, right? So there is a big historical part to this, right? There's a historic analysis, and it is interesting in and of itself. Okay. So this is where I would have gameplay of Edinburgh, but unfortunately, due to recording issues, which you might have noticed if if this particular video happens to stutter, I was not able to upload and make a montage out of my personal recordings, which I have indeed captured, but I have not recorded. But instead, there's a gameplay tour of Edinburgh I highly recommend. It's called Edinburgh Tour and Forza Horizon 4, uploaded to YouTube by Edinburgh Fudge. And like with the no-clip documentary about Microsoft Flight Simulator, there's going to be a link to this in the description, right? So this is a tour I invited you to embark on. I think the content creator does an excellent job at describing the town, and also he has the advantage of having being born and lived in Edinburgh for his entire life, an advantage, for example, over me, who I've just been here since September, and I might not be as knowledgeable or have as strong of a connection to the town of Edinburgh. So you might ask yourself, so what? Why does this matter? Why is this talk relevant? Why do we care about video game cities when they're just video games, right? Why do we care about these reflections? And that is because if the real world can inspire video game designers, then video game designers can inspire the real world all the same. And my main takeaway, and the thing I'm thinking of, the thing I want to impart is that to anticipate the designs of the future, we must look at how we design new worlds today. And a lot of the more interesting new worlds, are made part or come to us as part of the digital, right? It is hard to start from the ground up, but with video games you can, and we do. And what does this say about us? What does this say about the future of architecture, of design? And I truly think that in the future we will see architects and city planners join forces, which get with game designers that have also designed cities in video games. I think if you are a level designer, if you are a game creator, if you are a city creator, or like if you worked, for example, for Forza Horizon 4, the future of reflections of video game cities, real life cities in video games, is that you will eventually also go to work on, impacting the real world and real life. And that was it. Thank you so much, everyone, for my talk. Right under 50 minutes. These are all the work I've cited. So this is the Esposito article, the Game Informer interview I mentioned. This is the Manilev um, interview I've quoted, and was the bulk of my theory for this talk, right? And a fun article on Pokemon Go and what it teaches us about geography, and the 2018 Guardian article I mentioned about making Forza Horizon 4. These are all of my image sources, all of them annotated, all of them, correctly sourced. What happens now? So first of all, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for devoting 50 minutes to this talk. Um, so after this talk is over, we will go onto Teams for a in-person Q&A, right? So there will be a link in the YouTube comments sent either by myself or my colleagues or both, inviting you to the Teams, where we will have a live Q&A about a talk, where you can give feedback, where you can ask me questions, where you can input in any way that you would like. And I'm excited to see where the discussion will go. If you have any comments for this YouTube video in particular, I will still be here after this video is over. So if you see that the video ends, I will still be in the comments for a little bit to answer any lingering comments. Other than that, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your feedback, and thank you for joining me in exploring, cities, reflections of real life cities in video games, and in particular Edinburgh. It's been phenomenal for me to put this talk together, and also, I feel closer to Edinburgh right now. I feel closer to the town I currently live in, and yeah, video games. I love video games, and I hope you also find something refreshing, or at least at the very least interesting about them as well. Okay, until next time. Thank you so much.